Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Topical Talkology. Morning, Theo and Alexi. How are you
Good
guys?
morning, Andy.
Great. So, anyway, it's one of the things we were just discussing before this podcast was what we were going to actually cover today, and the whole theme really sort of has come about as to how much politics is having such an influence in areas where it shouldn't even touch. So, for example, in the UK, we've actually had to deal with the whole football thing and where the government's actually getting involved. Should they? That's a question we should probably be talking about. What's happening in America in terms of the mob justice. So, and that was being politicized by the White House administration as well, in terms of what's happening. And I think only recently, I think it was a 16-year-old girl that was shot, I think, as well. So the thing is, how much of it is seeping into football? It's seeping into so many areas, and particularly, because I was just arguing, particularly when it comes to something like Boris Johnson, as a Tory capitalist government, should they be getting involved in stopping a breakaway football, whether you agree with it or not? Should they actually get involved with that? So, guys, I'm going to throw this one over to you before, because I sound like I'm waffling.
No, I think that's very concise and thought-provoking, Andy. Over to you, Alexi. What are your thoughts?
The comments we were having offline just before was that any government, and especially your point about the entrepreneurial conservative government, about enterprise, the family unit, core values. It seems like the core values are thrown out of the window. And it seems like Boris Johnson and his immediate circle just want to be liked. And I think a lot of that is to do with social media, because social media is all about, the dopamine hit. It's about being liked and being loved and having many hits and many followers. And for Boris to jump on this and say, we want to intervene in private enterprises in one of the biggest sports in the world, and actually possibly put a law through, because we've got a majority government, so it gives him carte blanche to do what he wants, which I don't think is appreciated by the millions of fans, to actually stop the boardrooms in the football clubs, stop them actually doing what they want with their own companies and forcing them to answer to the fans. So I said to Theo before we started, I follow Formula One. It's a $2 billion industry. Is this what we're going to do with every sport now? And no, they shouldn't be involved at all. Butt out, stay out, take the taxes, and be quiet. That's to do with the FA and the other big.
And this, yeah, I mean, this is whether you agree with it or not. I mean, the thing is, actually, Theo, the question I want to ask you is, with regards, is when is enough enough when it comes to social media and the amount of power they're allowed to actually have by the state? I mean, is there not a line when it starts to become regulated, or there are stricter regulations, or are they going to be listed as a publisher because they're not considered a publisher, which means they have to have more stringent guidelines, do they not?
Well, you're right, but there's two enormous issues. The first one, just before the question you asked me, but the question you asked me, the nature of social media is such that it should actually be made illegal immediately. And the reason is the concept of the global narrative. So for the first time in history, you can form a global narrative round the world within seconds. And the problem with that is, in democracies, then there is the vested interest of staying in power, of achieving power, or of making your opponent look bad. And therefore, the first question about what the government should and shouldn't be doing with sport, it's all about vested interest as dictated by social media. And there's a great comment by Peter Hitchens this morning, where he says, I'll never understand this country where you can strip people of their liberties, you can prevent global travel, you can shut down education, you can destroy businesses and livelihood, and the British will simply retire to their gardens and have a drink. Or you can fiddle with Premier League football and the entire country rises up. And of course, the answer to that is social media. because that's the narrative that social media dictated. That is the power. So, forget Carrie Simmons running Downing Street. It's social media that's running the world. And the trouble with that is that fake news travels 6 times faster than real news. And therefore, you can't even have a logical or true or reasonable or fair or positive global narrative. Another example being, Boris Johnson is busy trying to appease the green social media because it's not another vote winner. And of course, what he's entirely ignoring is that he's hamstringing large sections of the British society with promises and requirements for insulation, for sources of power, and environmental stuff, which will make everything more expensive and impossible to sell older houses. Whereas India and China are busy discovering ever bigger coal fields. So it's a bit like trying to bail out the Atlantic with a teaspoon. He's, in other words, hamstringing the UK economy, an order of magnitude worse than any possible Brexit would do.
Yeah, mainly because of self-interest. And I was again, just before we start the podcast, I was discussing it with Theo about how social media now the pendulum has gone far too far the other way to the worst extreme, if you like. That even the biggest sport in the world, again going back to football, all the associations, the FIFA, the FIA in England, and all the big associations have said we are now going to boycott social media for 4 days, blackout, nothing at all platforms, purely because of the main instigator for that was racism. And they said, well, because we've gone to the head of social media, Mr. Mark Zuckerberg, and said, can you do something about it? Can we have some kind of regulation? Ban people who are making these racist comments on social media. They did nothing. They didn't respond. They said, okay, now we have to take it in our own hands. So it goes back to your point. It needs to be at the very least regulated.
I mean, it's interesting because
social media again is it's an entirely illusionary concept. Its power comes from its usage, and the population of the world is simply providing it its substrate. It's a bit like the ancient gods of Egypt or Greece or Rome. Their power stems from how much people believe in them. So if we boycott it, it will have no more power. Take away the oxygen.
Well, the thing is, I think people need to be coming off social media in effect, because they actually have total control. I mean, if your business is reliant on things like social media and Facebook, and they decide, oh, well, and this is what they do. They change the algorithm quite regularly, so you don't actually, so you can't build it. So they can literally take your business very, very quickly.
And also, let's.
And actually, I've seen it happen to several people who they've got an algorithm and they've worked it out, and they've managed to get so many followers and connections, and all of a sudden, someone like Google, Google, Facebook, they've changed the algorithm, and then they're not getting the same level of likes. So, for example, you will get a post from several people, and Alexei could actually have the same list and get a totally different set, depending on how his algorithm is actually working.
But if I can interrupt very quickly, I think the point you made yourself, Andy, in previous podcasts about you've gone off social media, you've switched off on a lot of platforms. The point is about basic self-responsibility and self-control. And what I do not appreciate is nowadays, last 20, 30 years, we have to blame everybody else and everything else, but you don't take responsibility for your own actions. It's a bit like the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral, and the BBC set up a complaints email for people to complain if there was too much coverage. So they already preempted the complaint rather than just saying feedback, please, for example. And yes, lots of people complain, but the point is you've got the off button. You've got
that's right. I mean, this is where I think people are actually stupid and they've become dependent, because there's plenty of other channels. There's Netflix, there's Amazon Prime, there's Disney Plus, there's Hulu or whatever it's called. There's Netflix. Plenty of other there's plenty of other things you can actually do, and you're complaining about Prince Philip's funeral is
But you
ridiculous.
see, political
And
correctness
again,
is the reverse of taking responsibility. Political correctness is the perfect excuse to have zero responsibility and is the champion of mediocrity and victimhood.
so okay, so the topic I want to probably target for a little while, because it happened in the last week, was this whole George Floyd, the policeman who actually got convicted. He got found guilty on 3 counts of murder 2, murder 3, and manslaughter. And I think it was within a day or 2 days of that happening, you actually had a young girl get shot several times by a policeman. I think it was in Ohio, because she was about to stab another girl. And so that's come out. Yet the White House, I think he was in LeBron James, who's the basketball player, all vilified this, made it about race, whereas there was this one girl looking to stab another black girl, and the policeman actually intervened, and he had I think it was about 9 seconds he actually had to make a decision. Now, if you actually consider, for every 0.001% of these, let me call them, terrible things happening, you don't actually hear about the other 99.99999 things that the police do right over there. Yet the narrative that's being put forward on social media and things like this is almost like mob justice. Do you not think?
But that's exactly right, and it's a bit like when you advertise the lottery. You will advertise the winner, but if you gave exactly the same time to everyone who didn't win, you'd have to spend something like 75 years on an advert. So it just doesn't make sense to the narrative they want to spin, and that brings us to the point of influencers. And that's another big problem with social media, because who decides who the influencer is? Humans are hardwired to want to be led. We seek leadership. And religion, which is based on centuries and millennia of mankind investigating his own nature and what's good for him, and by tying together ancient Mesopotamian legends, has sort of figured out a relatively healthy, collaborative, peaceful way of coexisting with each other, which needs quite strong leadership and structure. But in the absence of that, then what you're left with is, what are you left with? You're left with A-list celebrities. You're left with football players. You're left with Lewis Hamilton, for crying out loud. You're left with politicians who are entirely self-serving.
And actually, that's an interesting one, because there's a big. I mean, I saw there was a big double standard. I mean, I think it was Donald Trump who actually got impeached the second time for apparently inciting violence, whereas Maxine Waters, who's actually gone, who went over to I think it was the courthouse or whatever it was, when this, I think David Chavain or whatever his name was, and says they need to become more confrontational, basically forcing, because the thing is, I think one of the jurors actually, or one of the alternate jurors, actually came out and said, we were so terrified of having our houses burned down or being attacked or whatever, that they were almost intimidated into making a decision that was going to put this man away for the rest of his life. Now, did he deserve to probably be held accountable? Yes, I think he did. I mean, I don't think he intentionally went to kill someone, particularly with so many people watching.
Exactly.
But the thing is, they wanted to make it. They politicized it, and looked to make it a message. So I think it was even Joe Biden who actually made a statement before the verdict was even reached. So when you're talking about fair justice and following a sort of a due process, did that guy get a fair trial? Now,
no, of course he didn't.
And chances are, after what Maxine Waters did, she will get a. He's probably likely going to get an appeal. But the thing is, how does she get away with saying that? And